Schopenhauer said, if we knocked on their graves and asked the dead if they would like to rise again, they would surely shake their heads. Schopenhauer is being coy here. He's really not being clear about why the dead would want to stay dead. Eugene Thacker has a very nice response to this quote where there isn't a lot of clarity offered, but it's pretty great. It goes, in Western culture, it's commonly accepted that one celebrates birth and mourns death, but there must be a mistake here. Wouldn't it be more sensible to mourn birth and celebrate death? Strange, though, because the mourning of birth would presumably last the entirety of that person's life, so that mourning and living would be the same thing. So it's still not clear what exactly we're mourning as we live, what exactly we are getting away from when we die. Now, the obvious answer is probably suffering, right? We suffer through life, and then in death our suffering finally ends, but I think this is a little bit oversimplistic. I don't feel like that's what Schopenhauer or Thacker were talking about. Maybe the problem of living is uncertainty. Maybe for the first time when we die, we are solidly in place in our graves. This is the Theory Creep, and today we're talking about dead bodies, which I guess is kind of a continuation of our previous discussion of bodies at risk. Now we're talking about bodies at rest. So if it's true that in death we're for the first time solidly in place, and through life we're experiencing uncertainty and unknowing, a lack of truth, and if truth occurs at death, this is a profound reversal. It's a rejection of interiority and an embracing of surfaces. Traditionally, in the body versus being kind of debate, being has reigned supreme. The body is often seen as a vessel for the self, whether it's the soul or the brain or the mind or your identity. You are very rarely seen as your body. Usually you're seen as something inside your body that drives it. And in this traditional view of body versus being, it's interiority that's the gateway to truth, right? Authenticity is found inside ourselves. It's not found on our skin. It's found in our soul or in our mind. I really think that this is a fantasy, though. We don't really know anything about our inner world. If you just ask Freud, we're like, and like, what's the traditional Freudian high school metaphor? Like we're like an iceberg poking out of the ocean. We're a messy pile of secrets. Our future is indeterminable. We don't know where we're going. We don't remember where we've been. We don't know why we do the things that we do. The inner world, our being, is really defined by uncertainty. And the only certain experience in our life is probably the moment of our death. Gerhard Richter, a German formalist painter, has a series of portraits of the Baader-Meinhof group that are pretty relevant to this discussion. This series really manifests the reversal of being over body, of content over form. So these are formalist paintings. They occupy the level of the surface, and they resist a depth of understanding. There's no content in these paintings. We don't actually know who we're looking at. In fact, often the subjects of the paintings were misidentified for other members of the cell because critics and the audience of the paintings, they knew that Richter was painting members of the Baader-Meinhof cell, but often you just look at them, like these paintings are so blurred, so indistinct, it's impossible to know which member of the cell he was painting sometimes. Now, to be clear, there is content in these paintings. At least there's implied content. There's a pretty complicated and interesting and nuanced story behind the Baader-Meinhof group. It's just that story isn't present in the form of the painting. So what stories are these paintings not telling us? Like I said, it's of the Baader-Meinhof group. And if you don't know, they were a group of either terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on your perspective. In West Germany, they were arrested, imprisoned, they went on a hunger strike, and either committed mass suicide or were murdered by the West German government. Really, again, it's all a matter of perspective and opinion, what you think actually happened to these young people. Either way, it's very tragic. They're extremely empathetic figures in these paintings. We're encouraged to identify with them, which was problematic for a lot of people in West Germany. And truth in the Baader-Meinhof story is very hard to nail down. So this begs the question, where is the uncertainty in these paintings? Do we locate uncertainty in the form? Certainly the form of these paintings is extremely indistinct. It's blurry, it's faded, it's hard to identify who these people are. The content of this story also resists a clear understanding. Did the cell members kill themselves or were they murdered? Were they terrorists or were they freedom fighters? This confusion is manifested by the paintings, but it doesn't happen on the level of content. The form that Richter chose to represent these subjects manifests the confusion of their story. The form manifests the content of these paintings. Usually it's the other way around. Usually painters would have a narrative they wanted to tell with their painting, and then they would drape the form of their painting over that narrative. They would choose colors and shapes that would represent the story they're trying to tell. But that's not what's happening here. Richter isn't telling a story, he's eliciting a feeling that happens to correspond to the biography of his subjects. But he's not telling his subjects' story with these paintings, he's just letting us feel their story. Identification is a big part of these paintings as well. They beg us to identify with their subjects, but they also resist any kind of connection. It's very hard to see the person we're looking at in this painting, and one has to ask whether we're just seeing ourselves in these blurry shadows. So Richter rejected content and context. He was a formalist, and he really put his money where his mouth was, because ultimately the Baader-Meinhof series was sold to a gallery in New York City, where I think it's still on display. So Richter intentionally took his paintings out of their original context and put them somewhere where they could be viewed formally, because context gets in the way of meaning. We should think about the fact that these paintings are currently absent from their original environment, because absence is usually placed under presence as far as, sources of authenticity. The more authentic experience is the more present experience. It's the one that's more immediate and in front of us. But if we look at the subjects of these paintings, they seem extremely distant. They seem like they might slip away at any moment. Absence is a huge part of this series. Literally, Richter's subjects are absent. They're dead. And figuratively, they're absent as well. They're blurry and indistinct. It seems like they're at risk of disappearing, or maybe they already have disappeared. And yet, they're extremely empathetic figures. We're encouraged to identify with them. This is a mediation of proximity and distance, of presence and absence. Richter is trying to merge presence and absence. Now, something very interesting has happened to the subjects of Richter's paintings here. When people become this indistinct, when they become this vague, they gain a kind of iconographic status. They become ghosts. They're so vague, so indistinct, that we can't identify them as a singular person anymore. They're like a cartoon character or a cave painting. They're templates or pages in a coloring book where we can kind of fill in our own experience, our own context, and our own self. We see ourself in these paintings. They're a mirror to some extent. And this superficiality isn't at the expense of depth. In fact, for Richter, this superficiality is what facilitates depth. Remember, for Richter, form elicits content. It's not that form replaces content, it's just that form is the avenue to content. So Richter's rejection of personal history and content, and his obsession with surfaces and representations, should remind us of the way that celebrities and performers, such as stuntmen and daredevils, are objectified by stepping on stage. As we mentioned in this video, which I'll throw up somewhere, stuntmen and powerlifters and daredevils, they become their bodies. They lose their interior self. They're hollowed out, and they become just this physical surface. This is a suicide of the soul. It's a self-obliteration. It's a form of death. Now, when you watch something die, you're really watching a being turning into matter. It's an incredibly stark contrast. When a being is alive, there's a future, there's a past, there's intentionality, there's dreams, desires, fears, all this messy, non-physical stuff. And then when you die, you're just a thing. You're just a pile of matter. And in a way, this offers us a level of certainty. When we're a being, when we're alive, it's very hard to nail down what we are. When we're dead, we're a very discrete entity. This is also true of the kind of death that celebrities undergo. This form of death through performance offers the celebrity a level of certainty that is rarely found in our living life, which is why performance is a form of death. And the certainty offered by the objectification of performance is something that audiences and anonymous people like to imitate, because it offers them a level of certainty, again, that is rarely found in life. It gives us a weightiness, an escape from the unbearable uncertainty of our being. Objects are inherently more secure than subjects. Though the subject has agency, it can look away from the object, it's riddled by insecurity and confusion and blurry indistinctness. The object has a firmness. It's something you can see and touch. We never see or touch our inner world. The eye isn't a subject in its own view. The solidification and objectification offered by self-presentation explains why we're seeing such a mass proliferation of micro-celebrity culture, especially on the internet and on social media. By turning ourselves into objects through self-presentation, we gain a level of solidity and certainty that we just don't get in our daily lives. We tend to think that the presence of the other, that the immediate engagement with other people is a more authentic experience than engaging with people virtually. We think that presence is above absence, but as we've seen, the absence of Richter's subjects, the absence of the powerlifter or the daredevil from their self, the way that both of these figures become their bodies, lose their interiority, gain a kind of absence from themselves. These things remind us that our lives are vague and our lives are meaningless, and it explains why we're all in such a rush to objectify ourselves on the internet. In 2010, YouTube released a documentary called Life in a Day. It was a full-length feature film made entirely out of user-submitted footage. The idea was that people from all over the world would videotape their lives for one day, submit that footage to YouTube, and some mastermind editor would select for the most interesting and relevant parts. Now, this puts a lot of pressure on people to present themselves as someone who is worth watching. And I think this is one of the features of modern social media culture, and the emphasis that it places on visibility, understandability, and self-presentation. Like Richter's subjects, if all we are is our surface, then if our surface isn't visible or watched or intelligible, then it might slip away into nothingness. Now, I'm saying these things, I'm thinking these things, but I'm not feeling them. The last scene of Life in a Day is pretty striking.
It's nearly midnight now, and I'm running out of time to make this. I worked all day long. On a Saturday, yeah, I know. The sad part is, I spent all day long hoping for something amazing to happen, something great.
This young woman is terrified of not being seen. My theory is her practice. She's living what I'm talking about.
And for me today, all day long, nothing really happened.
This is the risk of a hyper-virtualized culture. When we obsess over appearance and visibility and maintaining an audience, we place ourselves under threat of obliteration if we lose that audience. This young woman is desperate to become real. She's desperate to become herself. And it seems that the only method that she has to do so is to become visible.
I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that I'm this great person, because I don't think I am. At all. I think I'm a normal girl, normal life, not interesting enough to know anything about.
Is anyone on YouTube really interesting enough to know anything about, to use her words? Or are people who present themselves in mediums like this just interesting enough to watch? What's the difference between knowing and watching? Is there a difference? Do we know this woman now that we've watched her? Is there anything else to her but this grainy black and white appearance, which, it's worth noting, looks a fair bit like a Gerhard Richter painting?
I want people to know that I'm here. I don't want to cease to exist.
She's right to be afraid of disappearing and ceasing to exist. Honestly, this vague and blurry and grainy black and white footage makes it seem like her disappearance is a real possibility. This is what happens when you reduce things to their surfaces. And I don't mean that in a contemptuous or kind of scolding way, you know, these are the consequences of your actions. Like, what I mean is that this is all we ever had. We've only ever had surfaces and representations. I think we were just lying to ourselves when we told ourselves that we had something else. So at least now that we're being honest with ourselves about what we have, the virtual, the formal, the superficial, I think this honesty might lead to more effective methods of management for this kind of pain, for this kind of loneliness. Like, I think that this young woman is effectively managing existential angst, and I think that everyone on social media is. Spaces like the one that I'm in right now are a way for us to connect with each other and are a way for us to affirm our existence. We tend to think that self-objectification is a negative thing, that we should maintain our subjectivity, our agency. But the truth is, objects have it a lot better than we do. Anyway, that's just something to think about. I'm your Theory Creep. This has been the Theory Creep. Hope you enjoyed yourself, and thanks for watching.